So I think just to get started, we should give a little bit of background as to what is Game of Stakes, or what was Game of Stakes. Is anyone familiar with what Game of Stakes? Okay. So, I mean, I'll give the rundown from the marketing perspective, and then I will hand it over to Chris to give a little bit of background. And one other thing I realized is we should probably introduce ourselves. You guys have already talked, but for the camera, we should probably run through who everyone is. So I'm Michelle, and I work at Cosmos, and I manage the community, and I work on the developer relations team.
I'm Jopinder. I run the Block 3 community Validator.
I'm Chris. I work for Cosmos, doing development and research, primarily on proof of stake incentive design and blockchain communication.
I'm Hendrik. I'm the co-founder of Certus One, which is a Cosmos validator, and we also do consulting on running validation in general.
Yeah, I'm Chris. Again, I work for Bitfish. I am the lead infrastructure, and we work in the blockchain community for meetup and knowledge. And yeah, we are more interested in delegation proof of stake and all the funny stuff that is around. Yeah, let's say.
Okay, so to give a little context, I think most of you know about proof of stake. Back in June, we had, at the beginning of 2018, we had 20 validators. And as of November, when we launched Game of Stakes, we were at about 250. So that was a pretty big uptick. And one of the things we needed to do was run an adversarial testnet to analyze our economic model, as well as the validator systems, and have them challenge and compete against each other. So that's kind of the basis, and then we also wanted to share atoms with the community, and this was the best way to do it. So that was the goal for it. I think it took us like probably a good 4 months to get this up and running, through KYC process, through contracts, legal, all of these kinds of things. So it was a long process. But maybe I'll give it over to you to talk just about, from the development side, what actually went in,
Sure.
and the philosophy.
I'm trying to recall the gestation point of Game of Stakes. I think
And
it
like
was
life
a meeting,
before Game of Stakes.
I think it was a meeting early in the fall of last year, when we were trying to figure out how best to ensure that our testnets actually simulated mainnet. At that point, the testnets were pretty small. Maybe there were a few dozen validators participating. They did not seem particularly adversarial at all. Validators would be nice and helping each other. And we were a bit scared about that, because we thought it was unlikely to be replicated on mainnet, where there was real money at stake, where validators might be better served, or might be rational by attacking other validators, by trying to spam the network, by using different kinds of operational configurations that we would only see, or we could only expect to see, when there was real money at stake, and when we kind of accelerated the time scale of the network to something that would simulate what would happen on mainnet over a long period of time. So that was the initial idea for Game of Stakes. Since then, I think it has become, in some ways more than that, different things to different people. It's become, or was intended to be, an incentive testbed for whether or not the incentive mechanisms that we've designed in Cosmos for rewarding validators for signing blocks and for punishing them for double slashing or for failing to be online, whether those worked well at scale with real money at stake, whether they incentivize validators to construct secure setups and to keep their setups online and connected to each other, so the network could make progress, produce blocks, and ultimately serve its purpose in being a ledger upon which people could submit transactions to. Game of Stakes also was a regular testnet in that it featured lots of bugs, which we relied on our helpful validator community to help us debug. And it was also, I think, somewhat unintentionally, a training ground for validators and a bit of a signaling mechanism for some new validators who might not have held so many atoms in the original Genesis distribution, which was a long time ago, to display their proficiency to the world of potential delegators on the Cosmos mainnet.
Can you go over really quickly, like a high-level list of what are slashable offenses?
Yeah. So, how many people here are familiar with Tendermint or familiar with basic Byzantine fault-tolerant consensus? Most people. Okay. So in Tendermint, all the validators vote or can vote on each block. 2/3 of votes are required to, simplifying slightly, to move on to the next block. And so in order for that consensus to remain safe, in order for it to be the case that validators can't just sign all the blocks they want and show different blocks to different people, we have to punish validators for what we call equivocation, or signing 2 different blocks at the same height. So that is by far the worst thing you can do as a Cosmos Network validator, and so we punish validators in the state machine by reducing their bonded stake quite a bit for doing so. A still bad but much less terrible thing you could do is fail to sign blocks. Your validator could be offline, you could disconnect your network, you could have your mempool fill up due to transaction spam, unfortunately. And your validator could fail to sign blocks. So if just your validator fails to sign blocks, it's not so bad. The network will continue without you, assuming you hold less than 1/3 of stake. But if a lot of validators go offline, the network might halt, which means it can no longer confirm transactions. So we also slash a little bit for downtime, prolonged downtime.
What happens if the network halts? Like, what is the actual steps to restart a network after a halt?
Someone who's not me want to take this question?
Yeah, that depends on why it halted. It could halt to an invariant being broken, so maybe a mistake in the calculation of rewards, which has happened before. Then what we're usually doing is doing a state dump, so dumping all account balances, dumping the state of the whole network, and starting a new network with a new version, for example. If too many validators go down, for example, and we don't achieve consensus for the next block, then of course they have to bring the setups back up to restart the network. So these are the 2 typical ways of halting we had before.
So one is like it halts, and then you just basically start a new network with the last state.
Yes, exactly.
And the second one is that you actually have to wait until those validators get back online.
Yeah, exactly.
But they get slashed until they become less and less relevant.
When a network is halted, slashing is not effective anymore.
Okay.
Because, yeah.
And how many nodes are the Cosmos network?
On Game of Stakes, we actually increased the validator limit from 100, which is what we will start with on mainnet, but probably soon increase there too. But on Game of Stakes, we increased it to 200, 300. Anyone who wanted to be a validator could be a validator, and Tendermint handled that just fine. But there is some limit because the communication complexity is quadratic. So in mainnet right now, we couldn't have more than several hundred validators without slowing down the network.
So maybe just quickly to talk about jailing and fee distribution and the economic model that was kind of put into place before Game of Stakes, so that some of these things were used in the attacks. So I think helping people understand.
You want like terminology introduction?
Yeah, and also just like how was the fee distribution for Game of Stakes, and how was the economic model, just for context. And jailing. That suddenly became quite important now.
Yeah, so I'll quickly introduce the terms. Fee distribution is the process by which validators and delegators, although in Game of Stakes we basically just have validators, get the rewards that they are owed for signing blocks and participating in consensus and for bonding stake. And this is somewhat nuanced because in Cosmos we elect to do this in protocol as opposed to just giving the validators all the rewards in a block. We think that that's what Bitcoin and Ethereum do. That's right. That's a very simple model, is to put everything in the block reward. We elect not to do that because we think it increases the risk of DOS a lot. It makes it much more profitable, possibly, to DOS validators who are proposers, so that you can be a proposer instead. And because we want to ensure that in our delegated proof of stake model, delegators get a fair portion of the parts of inflation that they are owed, as they also put their stake at risk, and that validators can't cheat them out of it or refuse to pay it. Jailing is a state into which a validator can be put under certain conditions. And at the moment we jail validators, or at least in Game of Stakes, we jailed validators both when they double signed and when they were down. A validator, once they are jailed, can elect to unjail themselves after 24 hours after a period of
Yeah,
time.
in the game of stakes it was almost 0.
Okay, so after almost 0 time.
Yeah.
But you do have to send a transaction as a validator to do that. When you are jailed, you cannot vote. That's the only difference. So when you're jailed, no matter how much stake you have, you're removed from the validator set. One advantage this provides, particularly with regards to downtime jailing, is that if validators are not signing, they're slowing down consensus because we're kind of waiting for their stake but never hearing about it. And if we jail them as soon as they continue to not sign for a while, then we no longer have to wait and consensus will speed up again. So it's sort of self-correcting in that sense.
One of the things we talked about before we get...
Can I ask a question of the
Yeah.
validators here?
You're not the moderator.
Did you participate as a validator? in
No.
Game 6? No. Okay. Otherwise, I would ask you to.
But I think we had one that was called Michelle.
I know! I still want to know who that was.
So I would like to ask you guys, what did you think Game of Stakes was? How did you decide to participate in it? And did you kind of have goals or any sort of broad strategies, things you wanted to get out of it? Or what did Bitfish to your best estimation?
Good question. Because I don't know how much I can say. Sorry about
Yeah,
this because
Fine.
Of course.
so lately. But no, mainly we wanted to join the Game of Stakes because we wanted to, let's say, try to test the environment like in a real world. So that's why we wanted to push not all the energy, but we wanted to go in deep and understand which was the limits where we can go and where the network can go to. And, let's say both on the technical sides and I don't know, also from a governance perspective, stuff like this. But it was just initially because we wanted to start some kind of business for staking as a service. But then we wanted to push and see technology, push to see which is the limit of the network itself. Like I said, not also in technology, but also from human side. Adversarial, people that anyway try to communicate and works in the same net. So it was also the group was one to test.
Mm-hmm.
That was mainly the scope. Yeah. That's
Good. Yeah, for us it was essentially 3 things. The first thing is we didn't have any atoms before, so we joined the community in the course of the last year. But in order to start on Genesis, we need some atoms to bond or validator and to create it at all. So in order for us to provide this service, we needed atoms, and the Game of Stakes was a great chance to get some. The second thing is we wanted to test our technical setup in really under adversarial conditions, so with transaction spams, with DDoS attacks and all these kind of things, and really test whether this thing we thought to be solid was really solid. And it really helped us to improve our setup also over time. And the other thing was to test the community, to see how strong the whole validator community is and how strong their technical experience is and how much load they can sustain.
Mm-hmm.
So checking out the competition a bit.
Are we talking about transaction load or social
Maybe
load?
we are, yeah.
Very similar from a Block 3 perspective to the Certus experience. We didn't take part in the initial ICO, so we had to look at a way of actually getting some atoms to then be part of the Genesis block onto mainnet. And one of the things that I think we're doing slightly differently is that we understand to start off with there's going to be a lot of human involvement in running validators, but over time, to actually optimize this as a business, to actually run it long term, it's important to actually get control systems to actually adapt to the environment that you're finding on the network. And so one of the things that we were using Game of Stakes and the idea of an adversarial testnet is that how do you trigger your control systems? How do you actually adapt your validator environment and your sentries so that they can automatically respond? and take as much of the burden away from the human and actually operate in a semi-optimal way to actually maintain availability.
And I'm actually interested, so you talked about why you're participating in Game of States. But I have kind of two questions. We'll get into the cartel discussion in a bit, but I would like to I would like to know what your strategies were without the cartel, and then maybe we can talk about how your strategies changed once you identified a cartel. But maybe talk a little bit before all of that, as you leading up to Game of States. What kind of strategies were you going for? More offensive, defensive?
So from our perspective, it was very much a case. We understand Go in as much as being able to read it to get the gist and understand what's happening within functions, but we do not have the development capability of Go within our team. So therefore, we were looking at Game of States purely from an operational perspective and looking at how we could run a validator in this environment from the best way possible. And so that made us adopt from the start and all the way through, it was going to be a defensive strategy. The only offensive action that we could take is more of a social, political influence action and say, these bad people are over here, they're doing that. And we started looking at tools and analytics to actually identify people and very much focus on the monitoring of it. Now, one of the questions that I get asked repeatedly on the Game of Stakes is, why did you pack your blocks with transactions, some of which failed? And it was simply down to a case of, we knew that we had to auto-bond and auto-delegate our stakes into the blocks to maintain voting power. But you can kind of get an idea of a historical amount, but then how do you actually predict how much or how many blocks you're actually going to delegate at any one time? You can take the Certus 1 approach of understanding the code and developing fantastic tools, or you can turn around and do what's called a greedy box packing algorithm, which is just have a guess, an intelligent guess at how many stake you're going to get, and then just put them in. Sometimes it'll fail, sometimes it'll succeed. But what we found of the overall experience is by building a control system to do that with defined business logic, defined controls, we were in less than 1%. We were, our error rate from perfectly optimal was less than 1%. And so it just shows a different way of validating and running a validator on Game of Stakes environment.
So you went in with defensive.
Mm-hmm.
You might have gone in with the opposite.
Yeah, strategy.
We should ask fewer leading questions. What did you do? What was your strategy?
Our strategy. It actually changed with the rules changing, but initially. So initially the rules were set to be that you had to get most stake at the end. That means you had to have really bring the others down. That was an option to get them either slashed so they lose a portion of their stake in the network, or to really bring them down so they're jailed and not collecting any inflation. So initially we've been thinking about strategies to take other validators down, which involve things like transaction spams, which worked when we did it quite a few times. I think we stopped halted the network 2 times and jailed at least in the some 50 validators. And we also developed a good strategy for auto-bonding. So withdrawing rewards and bonding them back to increase our total percentage of the stake and increase the amount of inflation we get. What we did was we had good insight into the code. So we both know the Cosmos SDK and Tendermint code, so we knew how the calculations went and where potential weaknesses were and how we could try to exploit them at least. So we wrote simulations, tried to find the best order bonding behavior, but then with the changes of code in later Game of Stakes versions, that's stopped working.
I know.
Yeah, you
I
know.
wrote them. Yeah.
You wrote it, yes. So we had to change our strategy. So then it was uptime. That was when we started doing transaction spams, overloading other nodes, taking them down. And it was also interesting to see how many people actually reacted and in which time they reacted. Some were really fast, and you suddenly started, like we all on Riot, and you suddenly started people reading messages and waking up in the middle of the night. And that was a great feeling, while I was up as well. So that's another point. I mean, Game of Stakes meant not much sleep in some nights. So yeah, their strategy changed. Initially we planned some DDoS attacks, but we didn't conduct any in the end, as they would have had to be so massive to actually take them down with the parameters of the Game of Stakes that they didn't make any sense. So we really stuck to the transaction spamming attacks and trying to maintain good uptime, which we did in the end. Unless people started censoring us, like your communism validator, and this woke us up at least 5 nights,
I don't know nothing.
5 consecutive nights, because we built a proprietary JNS technology, which allows us to maintain both high availability, while also increasing security and reducing risk of slashing. And we trusted so much in it that for each missed block, I was called, and that happened when we were censored. So yeah, strategy changed over time. I can say that.
I think my favorite Riot comment was, the next time you do a spam attack, can you make it not 4 a.m.?
Oh yeah, I mean, we were always talking. I was always saying I want to watch Netflix and just chill this evening, and every time this happened, I suddenly then did a transaction spam attack, and it was really funny. Yeah. So what about you?
Yeah, well, the strategy, I can say which was the strategy, not more in detail about application side, because I'm more in the infrastructure level.
Yeah.
I follow also the development part, because I was part in the game, so I knew more or less what happened. And so, but our strategy started with, as I said, let's say not from technology but governance, because we wanted to create a lot of us, a lot of alias, because we want to try to understand maybe from the lower side. We wanted to start to listening. That was the initial strategy. We started listening, error, attack, other validators try to attack. So we were trying to tuning also the SDK based on what was happening on the testnet and during the attack. So the great developer that we have in the office started to customize everything every time that there was an issue. Then we started to understand also how to increase our voting power. So we started, as you know, we started with 28% of the network.
Yep.
So then we started to grow, and we saw a lot of DDoS. Fortunately, we were very protected. And then when we see that the power increased, we started to think, okay, the fun is started. We saw that a lot of people start to play around and say, okay, let's start also to try to make some tests. So we were trying to, on the application side, trying to do some tests to, I don't know the word, sorry, for my English. But let's say that they worked more and more on the SDK to increase, not exponentially, but at some point started to grow more because of some validators. I don't know if they turned off the machine, but more or less they lose I don't know, the faith on their skill. I don't know. But at some point, then we arrived at the funny part that cartel went on the on the story. And so we started to defend more and more. But that was the let's say the peak part of the game where we started more to defend, because we received a lot of missing board trigger also. And yeah.
Can I ask a question about your infrastructure?
No.
Just a suspicion. Was there effectively private peerings within the validators that you set up such that they were able to communicate with each other efficiently, versus everything being all communications being on the public and effectively them being isolated, standalone?
Yeah, isolated.
Maybe we can move on to the cartel conversation, I think, because that was a little bit about what we discussed, is there a lot of research done around identifying the cartel, so, or maybe more than one cartel, possibly more than one?
I think there are
So-
at least a couple.
Yeah.
So maybe we talk a little bit about that, and then in the hard fork. Do you want to maybe give, since you did a nice, both of you all did a really good write-up, but when did you start to first notice, and what kind of was your strategy then for finding out the information you needed to make sure that you were right?
Yeah, it was this one night in December when Leo called me and said, "We're in trouble." And this was when the Genesis transactions were published, or when the Genesis file was collected, which is essentially the first block in the network, or the file the network is started from. And what Leo, my co-founder, noticed was that a lot of registrations for validators, so create validator transactions, came from DigitalOcean, which is a hosting provider. That's not a strange thing for itself, because we expected a lot of hobbyist validators to start on such hosting services. The strange thing was that all of them came from new GitHub accounts. All of them started appearing in the same time range, which was kind of strange. So we started doing analysis of the data, and it somehow became apparent that there was some single actor doing all of these registrations. And this is when we reached out to a few other validators, which was in this case initially Cryptium, so Adrian in this case, who then was also really surprised. I mean, he already heard a bit about it, and he approached me in the morning, and Leo published his results, so preliminary results. He posted in Riot and said there might be a cartel, and over the night people have gone crazy. When he woke up, we already had a group set up with a lot of people who were all concerned about this cartel, because this was the point when we had to change our strategy from being totally offensive to defending, because what we saw was that the power was somewhere between 20 and 30%. I think it's a 28%. 28%, and that would have almost been enough to censor us and completely remove us from the network. You need about 1/3 or a bit more than 1/3 of the network
But
power.
I want to say just that
Oh, yeah.
we reached a specific percentage
Yeah.
that we want to avoid that.
Yes, exactly.
To cut out.
Yeah, you didn't work towards getting more
Yeah.
than 33%, that can be said. Still, we were concerned because the Game of Stakes was meant to be an adversarial network, and we didn't know it was you. We were suspecting it, but we didn't publicly state it, and Leo began writing a blog post about it, and we started messaging Zaki and asking him what was up with the KYC process. And he was like, okay, we can either remove them now and say, okay, they cheated on the KYC, which I don't want to say you did, because as you stated in your blog post, you just ask your friends and family to register, which should be totally fine. We decided to do the more funny thing and wait for the network and how it plays out, because this is what Game of Stakes was meant to be. You wanted such censorship attacks, you wanted the network to be stress tested.
And it is true that the initial stake distribution of the Cosmos Hub and of most proof of stake networks will be pretty asymmetrical.
Yeah. So yeah, we were concerned, and we started messaging people we trusted. And so were these people. And somehow a group built up. I don't want to say it was a cartel, but it was a group of people who were concerned about this whole topic. Let's call it an interest group. We can say cartel. And yeah, we were all really trying to find out who led this cartel and what we can do against it. Because then we suddenly switched from being totally offensive to being very defensive, because someone was ahead of us on this thing, and that was stake. Because we didn't have that much power and we had no chance to defend. And that's when issues popped up on GitHub. We're talking about what you can actually do with 1/3 and how this can be mitigated in a way. Yeah, and this is how everything started back then.
I think from my side, what is very interesting is even before the first block of the first Game of States network, there were conversations about, well, how are we going to deal with this?
Yeah.
Do we ask Zaki to fork out this group ahead of time, or do we halt the network on the first block and say,
exactly.
we've spotted this, we should do a hard fork and get rid of them? And there was actually an awful lot of conversation within the validators, within the special interest group, to turn around and say, well, what is a reasonable and proportionate response?
Yep.
Because at the end of the day, on that first block, we knew there was a group of DigitalOcean people or nodes signed up. We knew that there were new GitHub accounts. There was circumstantial information, but there hadn't been an aggressive action. So it was unreasonable to turn around and halt the network, fork people out, and all of these kind of, well, what should we do? And so on and so forth, were all going on 24 hours a day in the Riot channel.
So you actually needed them to be malicious in order to, because that was something, when I was talking with you all, I was wondering why nothing was being done, and you were waiting for them to be a malicious actor, but isn't just the creation of a cartel itself a malicious act?
Certainly from my side, and I was very strongly advocating against forking out on block 1,
Okay.
is you have circumstantial evidence.
Okay.
You don't have enough reasonable doubt to say this is a unified single group acting together. So it's not fair or reasonable to turn around, because it may be a whole bunch of different people and they're following a certain recipe or a certain forum that we're not aware of, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why they should be allowed to carry on.
Okay.
Yeah. This was a really, let's say, decentralized discussion in this group. A lot of people had different opinions on what to do.
Yeah.
Some were more concerned and wanted to react more urgently, before the network starts. Others were more pushing to wait for actual actions to happen, and we were all expecting something to happen at some point. We were all waiting for it. We had proper monitoring set up, and this is also a great thing that resulted from this group. A lot of people set up proper monitoring to exactly identify these kind of things, to identify censorship, to identify a lot of nodes in the same geographical regions, and a lot of great tooling was built, and people started exchanging about this.
Okay.
And I think this was a really great result.
That's the purpose of the game.
Yeah. Exactly.
To bring all the people to think about awareness, and not only play.
Yes.
Because it's a testnet, but then in the mainnet, it's not anymore a game.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this is there's programmatic level slashing, that kind of provable bad behavior that gets sort of punished. And then there's a social layer, which is we have some evidence that they're doing some things that we don't think is proper or healthy for the whole network. Are there also things that are kind of in between? Are there sort of meta level activity that is in any way punishable?
Certainly a variety of responses to concern about particular network actors that I guess vary in their severity. Forking people out of the Genesis files is about the most severe thing you could do. But there are.
Are you worried about that at mainnet or no?
That wasn't the question.
Okay.
But you could do something else, like you could try to gain more information about these parties, these network participants you're concerned about. You could publish information that you already have without taking any action. You could try doing things on the network, like try censoring their pre-commits and see how they react, try measuring latency and try to get more circumstantial or even, strong evidence that whatever you were concerned about is actually
And the kind of evidence you would collect would be them censoring somebody, or what are the kind of lists that would be evidence you would use in this social layer for forking them out?
Yeah, we tried to collect as much evidence as possible. Of course, we had these Genesis transactions, which were kind of obvious, but then we started seeing other things. For example, when we did the transaction spam, the network halted at some point, and it was just halting because a lot of nodes went down at the same time, and there was a great.
Did you have a bad day that day?
Probably.
Not much.
Maybe you shut
Yes,
them
well.
down and actively shut them down.
shut them.
We don't know. But what we were able to spectate, and that was because we hosted one of the seed nodes. So due to the fact that we hosted one of the seed nodes, which is one of the first nodes the network starts from, a lot of people were connected to us. And we could monitor which people disconnected at certain points. And we saw a lot of disconnects from exactly DigitalOcean and from these validators we thought to be part of the cartel. So them going down at the same time was basically an indicator for them using the same kind of infrastructure, the same servers maybe. So that was also a sign we had. We had the censorship. We had other evidence. For example, Joe made some exceptional work with the graph database.
My approach that I was looking at some of the validators around me, and I noticed that there was a recurring pattern. And I was able to use the Stargazer API to just suck in data into a graph database. And one of the good things about a graph database versus a standard relational database is you can ask some really obscure questions, like if a validator sends a transaction of this type and at some point later sends a fee of this, then you can actually do complex non-joining queries on the data, and it's what a lot of the banks use for fraud detection. And so it's just able to use those same techniques and say, well, who is it that is exerting or exhibiting this behavior? And it was a big cluster of 71, I think it was, validators.
I have a question. I'm not very familiar. Yes, game of stake, yes, I understand. But just for me, it would be very important from validator's point. What's the pros and cons to use that one, and from developer, what's pros and cons to use use that game of stake instead of proof of stake or other ones?
So game of stakes isn't a consensus algorithm per se. Cosmos uses proof of stake consensus. Game of stakes is more like a test game, a test environment, and a test setup with some, but not as much as will be on mainnet, real money at stake to see what people do and to test our proof of stake algorithm. I wonder if you could also have a consensus that was based on that.
Kind of a good question for mainnet because transactions won't be enabled for selling out. So
Initially, yeah.
It's just a reversion of state. So it's theoretically speaking, the game of stakes can be continued into mainnet because technically the tokens have no value until they hit forfeit from an economic standpoint. So it's you could kind of attack the network, but then because there's no incentive to not attack the network because the tokens still have no value.
I think they have some value in expectation because inflationary rewards and delegations will persist.
I mean, there's also not going to be prizes on mainnet for people who are doing bad behavior the way there's prizes for people in game of stakes for doing bad behavior, right?
Well, a prize on mainnet, right, for bad behavior would be that you would be able
There's
to.
a reversion of state.
Yeah, but I guess I would say two things. One, I don't think the term bad behavior is actually that helpful here.
Okay.
applying like ethical standards to validators based on whether or not their behavior aligns with the best interest of the network is understandable, and like it's useful social pressure that can react quickly to unknown events, whatever those may be. But in the long run, I think it's not really the right design strategy. I think the right design strategy is to alter the incentive mechanisms, which we have a lot of control over in proof of stake, to align what rational validators will do with the best interest of the network. So to make it the case that to be rational is to be altruistic. There's no differentiation. Because if we sort of ask validators to be altruistic and to forego profits in favor of in favor of what they perceive as the best interest of the network, it's not an evolutionary stable game, because we will select against in stake the validators who follow those altruistic strategies if following the altruistic strategies is less profitable than something else. But that less profitable can include the social aspect. So when we say bad behavior, maybe what we mean is that validators might not do certain things even if they would be in the state machine profitable, like the calculations work out to get them more funds, because they would be punished in other ways. They might lose delegations from delegators who were choosing validators based on how well they thought those validators contributed to the network.
I think from one of the things I would say, for the record and to be quite clear on, the idea of forking out people as it happened in Game of Stakes, I don't believe will happen in mainnet. I think the overall mechanics of why things were done and why things were actions were taken on Game of Stakes was purely around this is an adversarial testnet. It is very different to turn around and spend fiat currency to buy or acquire the stake sufficient to own a third of the network. And if you have done that, then certainly, from my opinion, if you have spent hundreds of millions of dollars or however much it's going to be to acquire a third of the stake, then you've done it. It's your right to do that.
But then if it's like from a financial standpoint, or like financial instruments, depending if it's on the market, like you short it, you hold the network, everyone starts selling on the exchanges because it's a singular wallet essentially, unless it's a DEX, then essentially you're jailed, but you could make X amount of times what you lost.
You get into some really bizarre scenarios which we started to go down and said, actually no, this makes little sense.
Yes, I think the short selling aspect is dangerous, but I think in order for it to be profitable, a few things need to be the case. One, you need a lot of liquidity, and it's unclear that you would get that liquidity if most of the stake is locked up, because no one is going to be willing to take the other side of your short position. And two, if this is like a decentralized exchange, meaning that it's not subject to social consensus, then it also is subject to some sort of verification from the blockchain itself. If you break the blockchain, that verification might not work so well.
Kind of also another question on the sense of validators. Okay, so when the Cosmos Hub mainnet launches, like for the most part, there won't be any transactional fees. There'll just be like some inflationary rewards. Of course, depending on how the mainnet launches. Like as a validator, like what's your incentive to be a validator now instead of like later once more chains come up and start communicating? There's more transactional fees. Like how are you guys balancing the revenue?
I think that could be cynically translated as aren't you guys as validators going to make a loss until IBC? Yes. I think it is part of a long game. It's not a short, small thing. It is a commitment to make long-term conversations, and a lot of the conversations around on Riot at the moment, you say there aren't going to be any fees at the moment. As a validator in the Genesis block, I have to state what my minimum fee and my maximum fee is going to be for Cosmos for all eternity. It's permanent at this moment in time. So I have to make those business decisions now to actually make this a viable business over the long run. And that's why I think you're going to see some odd minimum and maximum transaction
To
fees.
be clear, you're talking about commission, right?
Mhm.
Which is separable from transaction fees. So there
Yes,
could be
sorry.
more transaction fee volume later.
Mhm.
But you're right that when you submit a Genesis transaction,
That's the-
you have to commit to a maximum commission.
So
Mhm.
how are you, we talked a little bit about this, but how are you determining this everlasting fee?
Lots of spreadsheets and
Yeah.
And
that way.
But a maximum and a minimum, can't you just do the smallest amount imaginable and the largest amount imaginable? You have, as long as you're in between them.
Yeah. But I think it's also about what people see. If you set the maximum amount, you won't be able to change it anytime. Like, never, essentially. It's fixed on the blockchain. It gives your delegators some kind of security because they want stability. They want to bond to you, probably for the long term. And if you can just change your commission rate in one day from 20% to 50%, you would essentially, like from their perspective, steal their money. And they want some kind of stability. We have two ways of controlling this. One is the rate of change that you can set, the maximum rate of change. So for example, I can just increase or decrease it by 1% per day. But I also have the maximum. And I think this is really a measure to give the delegators some security in their investment.
I mean, could you not also just start a separate validator and start telling all your delegators to start delegating to your new validator?
Yeah, I think you answered the question for yourself. I think it's going to be really hard, especially with people having cold wallets, to really force all your delegators to touch this cold wallet and redelegate.
Right.
I think this will be really hard, and you also want to provide your delegators, your customers as a validator, the best possible service, and that's probably not making them rebond.
A validator can't delegate.
They can.
Yeah.
I mean, could you take all of the delegated stake and just delegate it to your new validator who has like more sane?
No, you don't have control of a customer's funds.
Okay.
On top of that is like, so it's like, yeah, you can create a validator later on once the threshold is increased by the team.
Yeah.
So it's like, then it's like you could technically go to market, buy some atoms, create your staking company, you have some experience, and then you kind of have it, you don't have like the longevity of a company that's been there for, let's say, this first 6 months. But as like that, depending on the tool you use to a person delegating, that may not make a difference. So it's like the difference between like kind of why are you guys in it now, and then why aren't you guys kind of just waiting 6 months, letting everyone figure out the bugs, and just come in, fork some repo, and then just run it.
I think there's one argument that turns around and says testnet performance, game of stakes performance is effectively a beauty pageant. It is a look at what we have done in these different environments, and yes, it costs to run infrastructure, and to go for the first amount of time within mainnet, it will cost for infrastructure. But is that total cost less than running a marketing campaign and buying sufficient stake to attract people, and effectively you buy your way onto being one of the top 100 validators, versus saying, look, this is our proof point, this is 6, 9 months, 12 months of showing that we know how to run a validator in a solid way.
Another way of phrasing that is maybe that right now is the highest demand for validators that will ever exist. Everyone who has atoms needs to find a validator, and they haven't picked one yet. But that demand will go down as the market of people, looking for new validators decreases.
Atoms. Well, a lot of news, but what atoms? I don't know.
Oh, atoms are the token of the Cosmos network.
Okay.
The staking.
There are
So
The
that's-
staking
that's-
token, yeah,
that's
yeah.
something like this. But basically, so you're basically saying you don't have a real economic model. You just have.
It's like a dual economic.
Is that like if I like it's like a kind of four of your four of your speeches before that you said like you just have a bunch of spreadsheets and then you look what you do.
Oh,
Okay, no. So within operating as a validator, people delegate their atoms, their tokens,
Yeah.
to me, or Hendrik, or Bitfish, whoever they choose to delegate. In return for a validator processing and voting on blocks and doing the right thing and maintaining uptime, there is a commission earned and inflation earned within the network. And so my specific point was, I have to say I will earn 5% commission or 10% commission, and I have to scenario plan for all potential scenarios within Cosmos over the next however long period to then determine what commission I need to charge in order to run a validator, in order to accept delegations. And that's where I was saying,
So you have a couple of models, but there's some parameters which you
which we have no way of knowing.
gauge whatever else.
Because it becomes the more projects that build on Cosmos, the more value it brings to the atoms, and then the better the business model looks. But at this point, our validators can't really, estimate how many projects are going to be building because there's not so much information.
It's
and
not predictable.
It's not
Yeah.
predictable, and maybe we'll have 5 really strong projects, or so.
So,
not easy.
so as a for instance, if everyone ends up using Cosmos and ends up using Cosmos Hub, it makes no sense to charge 30% commission on delegations. You should be charging single-digit commission, so the lower bound has to be somewhere there. But in other scenarios, you have to charge more, and unless you get that commission set rate now, you can't change that in the future, and that's one of the challenges as a validator we have to solve.
Just gonna, before we get off the topic of delegations, from a legal standpoint, how do regulatory bodies treat, because technically it's like, you're technically a fund and people are giving money to you.
So,
Yeah, so validation on Cosmos is non-custodial. So you don't actually own the atoms that are delegated to you. You have no power over them except for using them for governance, if the delegator doesn't decide to do otherwise in the future.
and voting in consensus, yeah.
Yeah, and voting consensus, of course. And this basically, I mean, it's still a question mark from the regulation side, but that's more concerning KYC and anti-money laundering. For example, you could imagine someone stealing atoms, delegating them to you, and washing money essentially by creating getting rewards, getting inflationary rewards from them. So the biggest question for us is how to mitigate this risk. Maybe we have to do KYC at some point for the delegators. Maybe there's another solution to this topic, and I think we're all working hard to find this out and giving our lawyers really big challenges in solving this. But on a regulatory side, I think there's still no clear solution, and I think this will take some time, and it will take some large working proof-of-stake systems like Cosmos for them to make a move and make decisions. Yeah, but this KYC topic is like the biggest question mark, and there's an open GitHub issue about maybe introducing whitelists to delegations, so a validator can manually KYC and then whitelist single delegators. But that's still, the community is actively discussing this. But this is one of the biggest questions we all have on the regulatory side.
We need to consider also that regulation is also based on country.
Yes.
Some countries are more wild west,
Yeah,
So you have to.
yeah,
That's,
yeah. The same goes for
It's
liability then.
yeah, it's a big challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
But
it's,
Yeah.
I think maybe this is just my naivete because I don't know much about the regulatory side, but sometimes I see more speculation and concern about regulation that seems to be justified in the actions of the actual regulators, which tend to be fairly reasonable. For example, in Zcash or currencies with totally private transactions, and not even, to our knowledge, the NSA's best supercomputers, or perhaps at this point it should be the Chinese intelligence agencies' best supercomputers can crack, is just fine with New York state regulators, which are one of the toughest in the US, which are one of the toughest in the world, as long as you have proofs of provenance, proof of origin for transactions when you deposit into or out of fiat. So I'm not, I think the answer is that we don't know. And when you ask different lawyers, you get different answers.
I think one of the kind of final comment from me on this whole area, when you see the SEC turning around and publishing Bitcoin addresses and saying these Bitcoin addresses are used by Iranian botnets and you will be in violation of our Iran sanctions if you process transactions, it's that kind of awareness within regulators, within security agencies of what's happening that really bring this KYC, AML into focus, because if there is no way of me stopping processing that transaction, then that gives me heartburn.
And so speaking of government, or did you want to?
I don't want to derail this too much. I would say that my concern with I'm not a blockchain anarchist. I think regulatory bodies are by and large, beneficial additions to the world. We are better living off in a world where governments exist than one in which they don't. But I also don't think that, I think that the intent of the laws is much more important to worry about than the particular realization that exists at the moment. And there may be many ways to better implement the goal of anti-money laundering, which is not to identify everyone with every transaction, but to prevent particular bad actors from purchasing weapons, right? And there may be better ways of supply chain tracking or better ways of IoT monitoring that can accomplish that goal more effectively without requiring the same kinds of data collection or putting the same onus on people who are processing transactions.
You were kind of like invalidating the argument before you had said okay, right now it's like the anti-money laundering, it's only fiat that counts. But at some point you will be at the stage where fiat is just like the thing the old-fashioned people do and crypto is what everyone does. So if you say, well, right now it's only fiat that counts, in the long run it's the crypto that counts, but then you're back to the other argument. You're saying, well, you should keep in mind that the intention of the law, and the intention of the law is that we should be able to detect people money laundering, and in principle the blockchain, in general, like no matter whether you're Cosmos, whether you're good, Bitcoin or whatever that comes down the road. So, but then the question is like, we have both KYC and also the tracking. So you will have to have some mechanism where you can state anonymous in the blockchain up to some level. So maybe, of course, Atlas so-and-so did that and that, but we don't know who it is. And as long as it's good kind of good behavior or unintelligible behavior, like if I give $100 for something once in my life, I will care, no matter what that is, probably. But on the other hand, you have to have a mechanism that breaks kind of that immunity. And that's like, from a regulatory point of view, that's, nobody knows how to do that, I guess. So do you have any specific ideas how you would exactly kind of get these three things, like KYC, anti-money laundering, and anonymity into the system, and also make the regulator, using the regulator, maybe they also want to help you. So do you have any idea how to get these three things together?
Yeah. I mean, so it would be possible, for a very tangible example, it would be possible to alter the circuit, zero-knowledge circuit in Zcash to also prove that your transaction did not come from a particular address. And with some more difficulty, I think it would be possible to alter it to prove that recursively, to prove that if the Fed decides to blacklist a Zcash address or a known origin of funds at some point, then that gets committed as a transaction onto the blockchain. So the regulatory regime is not just separate, it's actually embedded in the blockchain state machine. And once that happens, anyone who wants other services of that regulatory regime, like entering in US borders, has to prove that their transactions follow the law. I think that the reason that hasn't happened yet is because it is quite expensive and complex to build into the proofs and into the application logic things which satisfy the regulatory regimes, but in principle it is possible. And in principle it is perhaps much better, like blockchain tax collection, for example, is likely to be much more effective in terms of compliance rates, which could be 100%, and in terms of overhead costs, which could be nearly zero.
So you
Try to rule the regulators now.
I'm not on a different team. I don't think.
the validators are the task force.
But
Basically,
it exists already a tool. I mean, a tool is a company that to do it like this. They are specialized in anti-money laundering, mostly on blockchain, Bitcoin, and
Chainalysis,
Ethereum.
are you referring to?
Yeah,
Yeah.
they are. It's expensive, but they have a huge. I don't know if it's a machine learning or something, but they can reconstruct a lot of connection through I don't know which level of the.
Yeah, well,
It's
unfortunately,
really expensive. They are American.
and the case with those tools is generally that they fail to differentiate between actual illegal activity and
Yeah.
anyone who just happens to have the tool and wants to target.
Yeah, but also in fact, yes, as I said, Bitcoin and Ethereum is the
Republic,
weakest,
yeah.
and they are that's marketing. Yeah.
So one thing we didn't talk about was governance. So just, I know we're going on but, a little bit longer, but we didn't talk about governance. And when we had the call, we talked a little bit about on-chain, off-chain differences of governance, and also things like KYC and anti-money laundering. Like, are these things that will be able to come into governance proposals? So that's one thing, but then also bringing it back to game of stakes, what, if any, governance proposals were passed, and was it because of the cartel that we were not able to do any? And just recap on this. Where
does the question go?
Were any governance proposals actually executed on game of stakes?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, one was accepted, and that I think one was accepted, and that was by no, it was rejected. It was rejected. That was Zaki asking to reset the game of stakes to a specific older state, which obviously the community decided that was not necessary.
why is that?
The idea was we had some, let's not say bugs, but a design flaw that caused some inconsistencies in fee distribution. And some people feared that this might affect the results of the game of stakes, because some got a big advantage in the beginning, which could have grown over time in stake rewards. And so people were arguing to reset, and Zaki said, okay, I give you the chance to reset the network to a state where this problem was not yet manifested. But the people decided against it, and I think this was the proposal that was the most active. And we also saw a change in how governance went. Initially, we had governance proposals being created with the numbers of GitHub pull requests, which is nothing that's solid, because anyone, like the author, can modify it at any time and can even like delete the audit trail behind it. So that's not good, but the process evolved, and some of the later governance proposals that were all rejected included IPFS links, for example, hashes, which were unique identifiers for a specific proposal, and I think the process improved over time. So this is definitely something we took from the game of stakes, I think.
And it was happening on GitHub though,
The actual proposal, so the information was contained on GitHub, so I think in this case it was changes to the Genesis file, which couldn't be enforced on-chain. Also because the on-chain governance mechanisms are still limited to text proposals, so no parameters can be changed, no software upgrades can be enforced. It's more signaling mechanism, as you stated it.
Yeah.
So I think then when you fast forward to game of stakes 3, 4, 5,
Yeah.
and the hard fork of it, what happened there is because Bitfish had run a really solid operation, and as they were kind of consistently performing above average, effectively, within the network, and as other people got themselves jailed or responded less well, they fell away. And what happened as a result is the original 28% increased to a larger percentage of the network, not by any bad means or illegitimate means. It's because you guys did a really solid job of what you had. So then, as a result of that, any discussion of do we do a fork, do we not do a fork, couldn't then happen on a on-chain governance, because Bitfish goes, no, I don't want you to fork me out, and it just it's meaningless.
And there was no way to hack, there was no way to attack governance and force them to have to vote, or force them to vote in a certain way. Okay, that's what I was.
I'm sure that
But
you're more than
we
capable.
could come out as a single to vote, for example, just not 71, but only one.
Okay.
If we met maybe some agreement,
Mhm.
say okay
Mhm.
guys, it's ended or not, what we decide.
Mhm.
I mean, it was just a misunderstanding probably, because we saw that 2 or 3 people in the riot decided, we have to fork. Wait, it's not like a normal, let's say, procedure.
Mhm.
You know, that was our.
So you would have negotiated, that's what you're saying?
Sorry?
You would have negotiated,
Yeah, kind of.
but you weren't
discussion
given, you
or
weren't really
public
given the
discussion.
opportunity, or didn't have.
Yeah, I think I would argue
we have
that.
to
Yeah.
came out and say, okay, we are Bitfish.
Yeah. I think there was the chance to comment on the GitHub issue,
Yep.
and we also sent out the email to Bitfish in the name of the group that wanted to fork.
Yeah, then,
But it arrived late. That was an issue. We used old means of centralized communication, and that didn't arrive.
No,
So that was like a sad coincidence then that this happened. But talking about this whole fork thing, I think in the end we can't say that there was like a good or a bad actor,
yeah.
but because you did an exceptional job running all of these nodes. I wouldn't have wanted to be in your skin
No,
while the transaction spams were happening, and network was running really solidly. Still, we have this one entity that could hold the chain at any time,
Yeah, that's
and this is really
dangerous.
dangerous. So this was the scenario that was in the head of a lot of people, and since the game of stake is an adversarial testnet with some value behind it, meaning prize money, a lot of people, including us, were just concerned that this cartel could start censoring us, and the uptime was the most important metric during the game of stakes. And simply by censoring, they could have made us like the last on the rankings. Even though our setup could have been really solid, the same goes for everyone else. And I think this was what people feared, because they built this really solid setup, and someone could just destroy it. And this was like the strongest motivation in this adversarial testnet to really do the hard fork at some point, because everyone wanted to come out number one.
Yeah.
In the end, you and us happened to come out as number one for good reasons, us for good uptime, you for exceptional running of all of these nodes. And
It was
doing
hard.
this experiment, I can imagine it was 70 nodes
More.
with all of them,
Yeah.
like
71
validators, but you had more.
Sentry, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, it must have been crazy and expensive and expensive.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I'm curious what Bitfish would have proposed as a compromise,
Oh, yeah.
and what the rest of the network would have accepted as a compromise.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Like,
sorry.
If you had had a communication channel, what would you have explained or suggested, or?
Negotiated.
Like, would
Yeah.
you self-slash half of
We
your
just
value,
we
or-
just wanted maybe to I don't know if we didn't have to contact them, probably yes, because you sent an email,
Yeah.
but it was late. But we just saw a kind of panic in the riot because of this, because everyone was thinking we were the bad guy.
Yeah.
Of course, I can imagine, but we didn't see a kind of governance from the top level, and say, okay, calm down. We need to find a suitable way, because it's a test net. We don't have to get panic, and fork out, because we are in a test net, not in a main. And so we have time to understand which is the best approach before doing quick things that maybe. It's not the best one, because I don't know the word, sorry, but in a decentralized stuff. You do a centralized thing to the either side. You go out. That was just our complaint.
Yeah.
Because we didn't achieve an agreement, all the community.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point, and this is also something was heavily discussed in the community. Yeah, I mean, this was a great test, and a lot of the responses were that the time was too short. I could argue, okay, we were short on time, Game Mistakes was about to end, but in the end, we all, the official communication channel. But yeah, what we learned from it was really to give the people more time to decide. It's not that this decision was in the end made by a single actor. On GitHub you can see that really a lot of validators officially agreed and confirmed that they wanted to join this hard fork. And there would have been the chance to start up a network without the hard fork, of course, which did not happen. I'm not sure what you must have decided for this. But also one thing was that people argued that the blog posts that were published clearly show one malicious actor. So saying Bitfish is bad, and that was never intended.
No.
Because the bad thing was not Bitfish.
Wonderful post.
Yeah, it was the danger of having a centralized entity controlling so much power, which in the mainnet could be really devastating.
I was about to say, let's
Yeah.
talk about that. Let's
Exactly.
talk about, we talked a little bit on the call,
Yes.
prepping, about what a mainnet cartel would look like.
Yeah.
I think you guys mentioned about voter apathy. So do you have, like, what are the concerns for cartel and mainnet? What would that look like? And and how ready do you guys feel for mainnet as a validator? Well,
Still
don't.
gonna run 70?
I don't think so. I went to sleep. No, I don't think so. No, it's a big problem. I mean,
Yeah.
But it's I think to start from for the government part.
Yeah.
That's it's the main filter is there. But I mean, what I think is that anyway, because you see in every kind of technology, then there is the bad actor that you can't control.
Yeah.
That is the main challenge of the technology, because you start a new technology, but then other people find a way to become a bad actor.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even know if I would consider, like Hendrik said, it's not so much that we're talking about good and bad actors. And
Yeah.
in fact, if you
Yeah.
run the entire Cosmos network in Amazon Web Services, it would be faster than running as a decentralized network across the world.
Yeah.
But you would lose the essential properties you want out of a blockchain. So, what keeps me up at night is more, have we designed the system, both socially and technologically, in a way that will allow diverse, stable stake and validator distributions. It's really hard to do that. It's most systems tend to be centralizing. It tends to be the case that the more stake you have, the more social influence you have, the more valuable that stake or social influence is. The returns are superlinear. And when you have superlinear returns, anyone who is smaller, starts out smaller, will eventually lose out to the larger actors in the network. This is probably true in some ways in Cosmos. The more stake you have, especially there's like specific thresholds, but the more stake you have, the more pre-commits you're able to censor, the more social influence you have, the more you might be able to bargain with other actors in governance. The transaction costs of talking to people are less relevant compared to the total stake you have. It's hard for a bunch of individual actors who might have as much stake, but it's harder for them to coordinate if they're not one single party. So there are dangers there. But there are also controls or levers we have which might allow us to react, both, I think mostly about the technical ones, how we can change the reward system to reward smaller validators a bit more, how we can make it the case that running a large validator is particularly risky. Maybe it puts you at risk for DOS, or it means that it's more profitable to attack you or something, to sort of disincentivize the incentive layer. And there are also social ways of detecting when these kinds of things are occurring, of communicating that to the stakeholders in the network who won't benefit in the long run, we assume, from this kind of cartelization, and can redelegate or can fork out, can make decisions accordingly.
I think one of the big things at Game Mistakes, and also the whole of the Gaia testnets, has really contributed to the research around distributed proof of stake is that traditionally it's all been very technical. It's been a very mathematical analysis of Byzantine fault tolerance. How does it work in these models? But what you've seen with the Cosmos community and in-game mistakes is that there's an overlay of social pressures that hasn't really been researched or considered before, but has a bearing on your ability to do Byzantine fault tolerance attacks. And I think potentially this is a new area of investigation and research by different people to actually bring in and actually enhance the overall security of blockchain itself.
Okay, so I think,
Yeah, but yeah, very naive question. Like, is there so basically, you said it's hard to avoid centralization. Is there any means, like it's very naive, I know, but is there any means to avoid decentralization or even measure decentralization? How do you measure, like, in a protocol that
So
is
listen.
decentralized or with a node is far away from everybody else? Is there anything like that?
So it's not necessarily decentralized geographically. The fact that one node is in San Francisco and another one's in Sydney,
Yes.
that isn't the concern. It's about being controlled by different parties. And the simplest way of doing that is look at the voting power within a network. If everyone is voting and delegated to a single node, they have a central authority, or they are the central authority within the network. The levers for that are entirely down to the delegators. A delegator can turn around and say, I am not going to delegate to this single one high voting power validator. I'm going to distribute my atoms and my stake amongst multiple ones and consciously maintain the decentralized nature. As a validator, there's relatively little control that you have.
Yeah, but that means like delegators mean like ordinary people, right? I think of delegators as the ordinary people. like-
No, I don't think that's quite the right. I mean, so the security
Well,
model.
if I consider, like, what's the typical delegator like as an economic player? Like, is it the banks? Is it the
Right now,
the
delegators are.
small guy from the street that every nickel that he finds on or she finds on the street puts into the, or is it, I don't know, like administration?
Well, it's permissionless, so to some extent we don't know.
Yeah, but like, but in the testnet that doesn't really occur, right? That delegators. What
Yeah,
delegators?
no.
So delegators and validators were kind of like closely.
Yes, it was
related.
essentially the same. So if you signed up as a validator, you got an equal share of the total stake pool in the beginning. So that was different from the actual network. In the actual network, stakeholders are all those people who own atoms, let it be an investment fund or some retail investor. But in the end, it's really just human common sense that should incentivize people to spread their delegations and especially look at the smaller ones, because it is about your investment. You want Cosmos to thrive. You want the value of atoms to increase, which means you want more zones to be in Cosmos. You want more value in the whole ecosystem. And people will choose the Cosmos ecosystem if it is decentralized and stable, because they are going to trust the hub, and they have to trust the hub. If the hub is decentralized because I, as a delegator, decide to just delegate to a single validator, which is top, and this validator manages to accumulate more than 50% of stake, for example, then zones might not want to use the hub anymore, which reduces the value of my investment. You can't expect these thoughts to be made by every delegator, of course, but this requires proper educational resources and for these people, and proper recommendations by wallets, for example, proper metrics to assess validators and make a profound decision. Yeah.
So wouldn't that be like an argument for actually separating like voting power from the atom itself? It's just that it happens to be like today I was supposed to read that on MakerDAO where you have well, first you have the Ethereum, which is just like to get some money into the system, and then the DAI that is supposed to be stable. And then you have Maker that you kind of distribute generously to the developers, and who else might want to screw up the system to keep them calm, so then we try to stabilize the system. And if everything goes bad, then somehow, well, there's kind of, yeah, anyways, it's kind of fun to read up if you haven't seen it before. But you know all about that, so yeah, so have you thought about this, like, just like, completely avoid these accumulation and almost like inevitable accumulation of atoms, I guess, in like a few players, like a handful of big players that determine the majority.
And this is almost the same question I had, which is like, if Bitfish had been like, okay, you guys can just burn half of our stake, can we remain in the network? Do you guys think that there would be actual just like sacrifices? Because obviously, like, okay, I'm going to redelegate it to other people. They're probably in control of those people or something like that. Like, is the only real way to just burn it at some point?
Is there a way for like you
Is that kind
as
of-
a validator
Well,
to say
I
like
don't
we're
know
not
about
validator
this.
anymore, like we send delegation
Yeah.
back?
That's the answer, probably.
Like,
So technically, like he could have sent it back or sent it to a single account if it was all just the validator accounts.
You
And then you
can,
guys fork that out, and he just becomes a validator with another node.
you cannot redirect delegations to you as a validator.
But,
You can choose
like,
to stop your validator.
If you like not really delegate, but you the validator are delegating to yourself.
Ah,
So then it's like
You can
before you guys fork him out, he just pulls everything off, sends it to a different account. You guys fork those accounts, and he just sets up another 70 accounts or another one account, and still has still the same control power.
that would be clever, yeah.
Yeah, that was like.
But was a rule, if I remember, that you can always
Yeah.
delegate. So people must have cut it out anyway.
But even so, I mean, when you construct, I don't think it's a likely defense. When you construct a fork, when you're altering state, you freeze the snapshot, then you can run whatever analysis you
Right.
want. So
Yeah.
you can find all these transactions, and then you can restart the new network eventually.
Yeah, exactly. So something you could discuss would be being able to set a maximum amount for delegations. So to say, I won't accept any delegations that would give me more than 10% of the total voting power. Something like this could be discussed and could be a topic for governance later on the network. Setting something like this, but this would be just self-protection, and essentially you could spin up another validator with another name, run by another entity that's still controlled by you, if you wanted to increase your income as a validator. So it would just be for like the surface, for beauty reasons, but really otherwise you can't do anything on that.
I would differ a little.
Okay.
I guess I would. I think your question is a great question, and I'm a bit skeptical about the value of the reason and the sort of future rational self-interest of delegators alone to keep the network decentralized. For two reasons. One, because the information cost of evaluating validators, of doing research into possible cartels, of like sifting through all this information and possible misinformation, which we saw not really too much of on Game of Stakes, but which I would really expect in practice on the mainnet, that information cost is super high. And as a delegator, if you don't have a lot at stake, it's not worth your time. Reason two is that it may be the case that this kind of altruistic redelegation is not in your direct economic interest as a delegator. Large validators who are making more money because they're larger may be able to pay you extra, they may be able to just charge lower fees, or they may be able to give kickbacks, they may be able to solicit from the governance system political advantages for their delegators in ways that smaller validators cannot. So I think we should try to investigate ways we can, if a cartel or an anti-cartel or anyone gets to 34% of voting power, there's not much you can do because they can censor any transactions they want around the network. At that point, you're at forking. But there are a lot of points before that when you do have options. The protocol itself knows how decentralized the network is. It has the information of which validators have how much stake. So you can try to counterweight that by giving smaller validators slightly more stake. Even though it's true that if validators are not Sybil resistant, anyone can run many nodes, there is some social cost to doing so. If you have to convince a bunch of delegators to try and balance their delegations between all your different validator addresses, that's not going to go so well. So it might be possible that we can give a little extra rewards in the protocol to smaller validators to try to flatten the power curve a bit. Another thing we can do is alter the punishment scheme. This is not something Cosmos does at the moment, but I think it's an interesting design direction. To try to punish correlated faults. So we could increase punishment for basically larger validators, or not quite that, but increase punishment based on how much stake was punished within a certain amount of time. The idea being that one of your advantages as a larger validator is the ability to, run the same infrastructure for more stake. You have some basically fixed infrastructure cost, after a certain point, fixed infrastructure cost, and then you can accept any amount of stake. But you have one particular infrastructure setup, right? It's not diverse. And so that infrastructure setup, if it has vulnerabilities, is going to fail all at once. Be that going offline, being it equivocating, double signing, getting slashed, be it something more subtle, like we might add more slashing conditions in the future. So one thing we could do is increase punishment according to how much stake is being punished within some rolling time window. And that would make it more risky to run that kind of single centralized large validator because all of your risks are correlated.
What kind of fingerprint activity are you able to discern for different setups in that scenario?
The simplest things are the things that already exist: equivocation and missing precommits. So if your single system is vulnerable to a particular kind of transaction spam attack, then when you go down, if you're 30% of the network, maybe we slash for downtime that 30% more. It's possible that in the really radical end of this design space, we can try to tie in application layer proofs of other things. Like there are proof of location protocols which work based on GPS locator beacons and based on commit reveal timestamp proofs. Then you could try to tie that in and reward validators a little bit for being geographically decentralized. This is plausible on Cosmos, over IBC, that kind of thing is possible.
Very cool.
Do you, one of the points you mentioned was the amount of time that it will take to research a validator in order to make a good, basically trust-based decision on their, and probably diversifying. You're going to have to research a lot. Do you see a business model popping up that people will do, not just the auditing, right? We have auditors, but that people will run scoring models on validators, and that will be a business.
100%.
What kind of models, sir?
Scoring models, yeah.
So I was kind of wondering more if
A
the community-
validator review site or equivalent.
Yes.
Well-
So will the community do it for itself, and will the community then have to score, be kind of the scoring entity of itself, or will it be maybe businesses popping up that are doing this?
I have quite a strong opinion in this space, and
And that's what you call it.
my opinion is that when you look at validator, when you look at proof of stake and all these zones, they are the lowest foundational level of what we're actually creating here. And it's really important now, and it's really important to get it right now, such that we can build businesses on top. And it makes perfect sense to have not just a kind of a review site of I give Certus a 5 out of 5 or Bitfish a 7 out of 5, a 5 out of 5, and kind of say this is a good quality validator and so on and so forth. But as you get more and more developed, it's like, what are the risk models that you can put in? And actually, this is a more considered thing. So if you are a VC fund or you're a hedge fund that owns staking tokens in your portfolio, you have an entire risk model that you can consider who you're delegating to. And it's layer upon layer upon layer of higher order service that gets built on ultimately what is a bunch of validators and a bunch of zones underneath.
I'm not asking as validators yourself and validators that will be in the mainnet, is like insurance, like something that maybe insurance for the possibility of being jailed. Is that like also something that's being considered?
We were having this exact conversation earlier.
I think that's a really hard question, because you have to find an insurance that actually insures offers you insurance for that, and this is a really high risk business, so that's going to be hard. What you can probably have, and I'm pretty sure Validators will set something like this up, is a pool to reimburse people if something like slashing happens. For example, if I charge 10% commission, then I take 5% into a pool, lock them up, and reimburse people if something happens, if I'm slashed, if I'm down, for example. I can imagine something like this happening. And this is probably like something like an add-on feature that a validator can advertise. But there's much more things to consider to judge a validator, and it's going to be a hard task for potential delegators, which is why we probably need some good metrics and potentially review sites, even though we're really afraid that these sites could get you into kind of hijack scenario, so they just rate you with a 1 star unless you pay them. And this kind of payments, we see that on other proof of stake protocols where people pay to get higher up on the list of these, for example, reward calculators and such. So there's going to be a lot of social things happening around that. It's going to be exciting and
Unless it's
really
like a Cosmos chain that's doing it.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing you can do is separate control of the funds associated with the delegation and the validator to which the delegation is delegated. So you can have like a proxy delegation, basically, where I consign to someone the right to redelegate my stake and give them some tiny fraction of my rewards, but I still own the tokens, receive most of the rewards. The advantage of that over the website model is that it has pretty well aligned incentives, at least if the underlying mechanisms of the protocol are accurate. You know, there's no advertising you can do in that case. The website doesn't need to adopt that model. Or the website needs to adopt the advertising model, but the person who does this proxy delegation is incentivized to pick the most profitable validator for the delegator. Maybe the disadvantage is that it doesn't give the delegator so much insight into the social layer, and could lead to these proxy delegators becoming really, really powerful in their ability to sort of, as unions, almost as delegator unions, to pick validators.
Exactly. As a validator, I could also pay this union, or
Yeah,
the leader of
that's
this
true.
union, to
Yeah.
give me a larger stake and incentivize them off chain to
Also,
miss
like,
money.
as validators, so right now just the mainnet essentially, but are you guys also looking to validate on other chains?
You have to.
Yeah.
Or
It's the only way the economics works.
So maybe just one last question from me, and then we wrap it up, or if anyone has some more. What would, if we could redo Game of Stakes, what would be like, can you just really quickly provide like what you would suggest, or like what you would have liked to have seen, or would have liked to have happened, or whatever, if we could have a future Game of Stakes?
So I think there are a lot of lessons learned
Yep.
or lessons identified within Game of Stakes and how it's actually put together. But if you actually go back to what I understood in one of the original messages around Game of Stakes, it was this idea of an adversarial testnet. It was, I interpreted it, maybe incorrectly, as being quite similar to hacking contests, capture the flag type contests. And I think for existing validators to ensure that they don't go stale, and for new validators, young validators, to demonstrate their capability and their ability to run secure validators in extra hostile environments would be a huge thing. So you could effectively have a Game of Stakes on an annual basis as a proof point of maintaining and refreshing and being competitively good at validating.
Yeah, I think Game of Stakes, as it was realized, was three separable things. It was incentive mechanism testbed, it was a standard debugging code change testnet, and it was a validator beauty contest. And I think all of those things are useful. I think they could probably be realized separately in ways which are more well aligned to the individual purposes, and that's what I'd like to see in the future. I think that.
Did you see those three? Can you specify how those three were mismatched in terms of those three things?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
That's a good question. I think the validator beauty contest interplayed with the sort of lack of clarity on rewards at the incentive layer and caused validators to make decisions that were more intended on sometimes about signaling for mainnet than they were for like gaining the maximum rewards. So you're not necessarily stress testing your incentives exactly as they would happen on mainnet, because mainnet isn't going to have that kind of immediate like cliff signaling value. And I think that also the fact that the testnet many times had to be stopped and restarted for bugs which were unrelated to either validator capabilities. And by beauty contest, that's not a derogatory. I think having that part be separate and running with more stable software would be helpful.
So that's going to be also part of mainnet features, like the
What, bugs?
The halts?
so the 1st of April like shutdown of the network.
Mainnet will also have.
Sorry, yeah, you were trying to be specific in that was the main point. Sorry.
No. Mainnet will also have planned halts and restarts, especially initially. In the future, we might have a more automated governance procedure. Now, I mean, halts and restarts sound very bad, and I think that is
Yes.
a fairly contingent consequence of the development of Nakamoto consensus, not an underlying principle of how we ought to design blockchains. Halting is very safe. If the blockchain halts, nothing happens. Like, people have lots of time to analyze the situation. They have time to get on chat channels. They have time to write reasoned discourse, email people who might not be their enemies after all.
And it can be a good thing if, for example, invariants are broken.
Right. Halting is always the safe thing to do. So.
And that's the one pay your bill instantly.
Yeah, right. I mean, in the long term, the network needs to be online. But in the short term, and even in the long term, you know, if here's an example of in the 2007 financial crisis, what should have happened was that some things halted, right? Instead of the system collapsing, there should have been invariants which were in place that would catch these things before they happened and would halt the bank's settlement layers so people could step in and decide what to be done about it.
Yeah, actually also like MSL put MakerDAO before, and exactly that's what they do, right? If things go south, then they just say, okay, they pull the plug, and then they just save whatever's left, and then afterwards probably they will restart again. So I guess that's kind of, yeah, that's like after the medieval age of Bitcoin and Ethereum, we're advancing a little bit further towards modern times, I guess. Yeah.
Well, there are downsides too. I mean, one thing is when you stop the blockchain for a network upgrade, it's an instant leverage point when suddenly there's no governance anymore for, you know, off-chain governance that's subject to different kinds of social pressures and doesn't have the same sort of value at stake to take place. Like when you guys timed the anti-cartel fork quite perfectly, when there already was going to be a network upgrade, people were already paying attention, they were already evaluating, and they had to sort of choose between two options.
So what would you change, Andrew?
What I
Or
would
not
change.
change, but what would you like to, I guess, see as well?
Yeah, I think also more clear rules. That would be really interesting because this helps align interests and improve strategies.
Yeah.
But I think Joe made a really good point about this being something like a testbed for new validators or testing run to prove themselves later, because we are probably going to see the validator set become more static, and in order to introduce some dynamics in there, people will need a place to compete, and this should not be the mainnet, as we don't want holes where there shouldn't be some, or just because people are DDoSing others and taking the service down. We don't want something like this to happen on mainnet. Also, we want people to be properly prepared to handle such situations. So something like a CTF styled test network where people just execute heavy attacks and have to defend against them. This can be really helpful, especially with major changes to the protocol or Tendermint, something like potential Tendermint 2.0 with a changed network layer. We want to test something like this and properly also incentivize so people try their best at breaking it.
No, for me also, I mean, in my opinion, I wouldn't change nothing. I mean, it was really. No, I mean, sorry. No, yeah, it was opposite. But in terms of learning, you know, it was really good. It was really good.
I'm glad.
We also written down in our latest blog post. It was a great experience. A lot of great validators, professional people. So it was a cool experience. So that's fine with this. But I also agree with the part of the capture the flag that it's more direct. And you know what I have to do. So you have to do that. That's also, in my opinion, it would be the best.
So more direct and run it again. Zaki will probably freak out, but run it again in a year.
Well, it doesn't
Every
need to be
annual.
coordinated by AIB next time.
Yeah.
And in fact, it probably will not be.
No.
And parts of the rule logic could be automated on the Cosmos Hub itself. So verification is done over IPC.
But it's at the basic of every software. I mean, bug bounties is a security baseline. You know? So this is the approach.
Yeah.
It's the right approach.
Okay, well I think I mean if you guys want to still ask them questions, but I think we've probably videotaped ourselves long enough and talked long enough at you all. So I don't know if there's any last comments or questions, but I think, okay, cool. Thank you everyone, thank you.
Great questions.
Yeah.